Hello there, and thanks for joining me. I'm Corel Painter Master AARONRUTTEN, and in this video, I'm going to give you a quick overview of how to use the Real Watercolor brushes in Corel Painter, and I'll follow up with a demonstration on how to create a painting using the watercolor brushes. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm using Corel Painter 2017 today. I've created a new canvas. I've just chosen a size that's 1920 by 1080. You don't want to use too big of a canvas with too high of a resolution because these watercolor brushes are very processor intensive, and it'll just be very, very slow if you make it too big. I'm going to choose this size here because it fits nicely on my screen for my tutorial, but you could choose any size you want. As I mentioned, I'm going to be using the Real Watercolor brushes. There are different kinds of watercolor. There's digital watercolor and there's regular watercolor, but those are both older versions of watercolor. Real Watercolor is the one you're going to want to use if you want the best watercolor experience. So you can go ahead and play with any of these presets here, or you can use some of the presets that I created in my watercolor palette here. Go ahead and just select any Real Watercolor brush. And then if you look up here in the Enhanced Properties bar, there's this little drop icon. We can click on that, and that will show and hide the Real Watercolor panel, and this gives us control over all the different properties of Real Watercolor brushes. And there's a lot of sliders here. They all do some different things, and I'll try to go over each of them one by one and explain how they work. But if you have any questions about how they work, you can always hover over a particular slider, and it'll pop up a little tooltip that will tell you exactly what that's going to do, as you can see here. But before we go into all the sliders, let's talk about a few of the principles of real watercolor painting. If I paint with a real watercolor brush, you can see that the watercolor kind of flows, and it works a lot like traditional watercolor would. Now, depending on how fast your computer is, this might be really fast, it might be really slow. Generally speaking, it's going to be on the slower side. You'll also notice in the Layers palette that it creates a watercolor layer, and this is a special layer type. It's different than the default layer that you'd get when you click on New here. You can only paint on watercolor layers with watercolor brushes. If I click on this watercolor layer and I try to paint with a different brush, let's say the airbrush, what's going to happen is it's going to automatically create a new default layer. If I click back on the watercolor layer and I select a watercolor brush, then I can continue adding to that watercolor layer as if it were wet. However, if I do something like convert my watercolor layer to a default layer, it's no longer wet anymore. So you could think of that as drying the watercolor to where it's permanently dry and it's no longer wet. And then it just acts like a normal layer. I can go in with one of my blenders and then I can just blend it as if it's regular paint. So watch out for those watercolor layers. Up here in the properties bar, you have a couple buttons, pause diffusion and dry watercolor layer. These are very important. Pause diffusion is going to pause the diffusion. Right now, you can see the paint is kind of trickling and flowing. That's diffusion. If you want to pause that, you can turn on pause diffusion. And if I paint a stroke, it's not going to flow. It's almost like the paint is suspended. Then when I unpause it, then it's going to flow. Now, if I want to paint and then it's taking too long and I'm getting sick of waiting for my paint to dry and I just want to dry it really quickly, I can just click on dry watercolor layer and it instantly dries it. It's still wet as a watercolor layer, so I can still add to it. And you can see I can add paint and it all kind of flows and bleeds together. But that's a little bit different than what I explained earlier when I said that converting a watercolor layer to a default layer is like drying it. When you convert it to a default layer and I paint on it again, the new paint that I add is not going to interact with that watercolor layer. It actually creates a separate new watercolor layer. So basically what I'm saying here is if you're going to work with watercolor, generally speaking, you're going to want to work on watercolor layers with watercolor brushes, and you're going to want to keep them as watercolor layers. That way you get all this interactivity between your paint and it all flows together in a natural way. Next, we'll talk a little bit about paper grain and flow maps. We have our papers panel here, which shows the paper that we're using, and we have our flow maps panel here, which shows the flow map that we're using. All of these watercolor brushes can use paper grain, and many of them can use the flow maps as well, depending on what you set this to. So right now I have a basic paper, but if I wanted to, I could change that to a watercolor paper. We have some here, like cold pressed watercolor. And basically what that's going to do is that's going to change the grain or the texture of the paper while you're painting. If I set this to something like small dots, you can see a noticeable difference in the strokes. The paper has more of a canvas feel when I use the dots. As I mentioned, some brushes can use flow map, so I'm going to select Noisy Flow Map Fringe. There's an indication of what properties the brushes can use based on their name. So for example, if it says flow map, it's using flow map. If it says texture, it's using texture, and so on. So let's try Noisy Flow Map Fringe. You can see I have the Fine Dots flow map selected. I'll select a different paper just to make this a more clear example, and I'll paint a stroke. Now what's going to happen is the paint is going to flow in between the shapes in the flow map. So if I scale this flow map up and make it bigger and I do another stroke, you can see here that I'm getting a different edge here. You can almost see those little dots and patterns. If I make it even bigger, I paint another stroke, you can see that the edge is even bigger and rougher, and you can almost see those dots there appearing. If I set it smaller, the dots are less noticeable. Now I don't have to use that dot pattern. I can select a different pattern. For example, I could try horizontal flow. And right now it's going vertical because I have changed my paper properties. You can actually rotate the angle of your flow map if you want. So I can put it more horizontally and my paint will flow in a different direction. And then of course I can increase or decrease the scale as well. So you'll see in my strokes I'm getting a combination of the flow map along the edges, and that's controlling how the water flows, but I'm also getting that paper texture as well. Now generally speaking, when you're working with traditional watercolor and digital watercolor, you want to work with very, very thin, very light, transparent paint, and then you want to build it up gradually. So I'm keeping my pen pressed down right now and I'm painting a stroke, but when I lift it up, the water is going to flow and it's going to get a little bit lighter as it dries. And then if I paint over it again, each time I paint over this, depending on the brush that I'm using, I'm going to get some different effects. This particular brush is kind of adding a little bit of water to this, so it's actually removing a bit of paint. If I try a different brush, I'll get a different result here. Let's try fractal wash instead, and let's see how that affects this. I'll pick a different color. You can see that it's building up, and if I keep adding to it, it keeps getting darker and darker. Now, if I choose a lighter color, you might not notice it as much. It's almost too light to notice there. Make it a bit darker, and you can see that it gradually, ever so slightly, builds up. Each time I pick my pen up, it's going to get darker and darker as I build it up. And most of the time you're going to want to work that way. You don't really want to go in with too thick of paint because then you don't get that nice soft effect that you would get that looks a lot like a traditional watercolor painting. You can also get some control over that using the opacity as well. For example, I could choose a nice saturated color like this and then just reduce the opacity of it to something much lower, and I get basically the same result as if I picked a lighter color here. It's just taking longer to build up. But again, you want to pick your pen up, let the paint dry, and then add to it after it's dry. And then it'll build up gradually, like so. So now that we understand some of the principles of watercolor painting, now we can dive a little bit more into these sliders because they're going to make a little more sense. For example, you can see that we have options for flow here. I could choose my current paper as the flow map source, or I can choose a flow map. I can show and hide the flow map panel with this button here. And then down here at the bottom are a few important options, which is actually what I want to start with first. So accurate diffusion, if we leave that checked, and then I select a brush that uses the flow map like noisy flow map fringe, I'll use this horizontal flow and I'll reduce the scale of it. Let's paint a test stroke. Accurate diffusion is going to more accurately diffuse the paint. Diffusion is the paint flowing. That's just another fancy word for it. So that's accurate diffusion. Let's turn accurate diffusion off and let's see what that looks like. They both look pretty good to me, so I really don't see much of a difference, but you might notice more of a difference with other brushes or settings. But if you want the most realistic result possible, go ahead and just leave that on. I leave it on for all the brushes. Delay diffusion is very similar to pause diffusion, except it's going to just delay it for a minute so you can see my water suspended, but if I stop painting for a second, then it goes ahead and diffuses. That's different than pause diffusion. Pause diffusion just leaves it suspended permanently until you unpause it. You can see that I'm lifting my pen up and it's not diffusing until I unpause it manually. And then there's a little checkbox for that down here as well for pause diffusion. Now basically you're going to choose these settings based on how fast your computer is. If you have a slower computer and watercolor's working really slow, you probably want to turn off accurate diffusion and keep delay diffusion on and maybe possibly use pause diffusion as well. That way you can go in and you can paint and you don't really have to worry about all that trickling and flowing and diffusing happening. You can just put in whatever you want here, and then when you're ready, you can simply unpause it, wait for it to diffuse, and you can continue painting and it'll be a little less demanding on your computer. If you have a faster computer, I would recommend turning off delay and pause diffusion, turn accurate diffusion on, and then you can play with the animation step, which controls the animation of the water flowing. So it's going to be a smoother flow that you'll get to see if you have the animation step at 0 Whereas if you put it at 10, it kind of jumps between animation frames, so it's fewer frames. You can see it's kind of jerky when I paint the stroke. Versus if I set it to 0, it's very smooth and fluid. Personally, I prefer 0 because then it makes it feel like it's kind of flowing in real time as you're painting. But again, that works a lot better on a faster computer than it does on a slower computer. And you can choose to turn these on and off for each individual brush. So the brush that I'm using right now is Light Fringe Jitter. And what that's going to do is that's going to give me an edge that kind of builds up thick, whereas the center is kind of a bit lighter. You can see that there's that nice fringe around the edges. If I compare that to something like Noisy Flow Map Fringe, it gives me a completely different result. This is more flowing and trickling into the flow map that I select. So they're both watercolor brushes, but they're both acting completely differently, and you can see why if you look in the Real Watercolor palette here. If I toggle between these two brushes, the sliders and all the different functions are all set to completely different things. So a little change in one of these sliders can have a big impact on how each of these brushes perform. Now personally, when I'm watercolor painting, I don't go in here and mess with these sliders constantly. What I do is I've just gone ahead and made some presets here that give me a wide range of effects, probably all the different effects that I'd ever want in watercolor painting, and I don't feel that I need any more than that for my particular technique. So rather than going in here and constantly worrying about what do I set these sliders to, just either use some of the presets that are found in the Real Watercolor category, because there are plenty. You can see here there's quite a few that gives you all kinds of effects. Or you can tweak a few of these and create your own, or create your own just by experimenting with all the different sliders. But as I mentioned, we will go through each of these sliders one by one. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's start with wetness. Wetness lets you set the amount of water the brush deposits on the paper. So I'm going to use this Light Fringe Jitter as my example. Right now the wetness is set to 75. Let's see what we get when we do a stroke. It's pretty wet. If I set that to 0 and I paint, I'm not getting anything because there's no water. So I need to set it a bit higher, let's say to 7. So this is kind of a thinner, drier result, as if you were using a dry brush without much water. And as I start to increase that, it starts to look more liquidy and you start to see more of that fringe appearing. Increase it more, I get more fringe, and if I go to 100%, then I'm getting maximum fringe for this particular brush. Next is concentration, which sets the amount of pigment the brush deposits on the paper. So the pigment is your paint. Right now it's at 100%, so it's going to deposit a lot of paint. However, if I set that much lower and I do a stroke, it's barely setting any pigment at all. In fact, once I let the watercolor flow and dry, it almost disappears. So it gives me a very faint effect, but if I keep building up on top of that, it's going to build up darker and darker each time as long as I remember to pick my pen up. Next, we'll take a look at viscosity. Viscosity can adjust the water thickness to control the way water flows and spreads out on the surface of the paper. For example, if I set my viscosity lower, it's going to flow a lot, so it's kind of the opposite of how you would think of it. You'd think 0 would be no movement at all, but 0 is actually a lot of movement. You can see the paint's trickling and flowing and it's going crazy there. Versus if I set this to 100% and I paint a stroke, it's not going to spread out very much at all. In fact, it doesn't look very watercolor when I do it like that. And then of course, a middle setting kind of gives you a little bit of both. Next is evaporation rate. That adjusts the speed at which the water dries. So for example, right now it's set kind of low, and I get this kind of stroke. If I set it really high, I get a very different stroke. It's going to dry very quickly. It's not going to flow as much. It's not going to get as much fringe. For example, if I select the Light Fringe Jitter, and then I'm going to go up here and just reset the tool to reset this to its default setting so it's acting like it was when I created this brush. I'm going to turn the evaporation rate all the way down, paint a stroke. And I'm going to turn it all the way up and paint a stroke. And you can see that it dries really quickly. You don't get quite as much fringe around the edges because the water is just, it's not getting very much time to move. It just dries instantly. So you could think of this evaporation rate as if you're putting like a hairdryer on this and drying it before it gets a chance to really flow. Now below that we have the flow area. So I'm going to choose a brush that's already using the flow map. That's the Noisy Flow Map Fringe. You can see it automatically puts flow resistance at 100% and it chooses flow map. That's this here. I'm going to go ahead and reset that brush. And I'm going to change my flow map to the dots. I'm going to make the dots pretty big. That'll make it really apparent what's going on here. Then I'm going to paint a stroke. And you can see that it's flowing in between those dots. If I turn the flow resistance down, it's going to control the effect paper grain has on the direction of the water flow. So for example, if I turn this down and I paint that same stroke, it's not flowing at all into that flow map. If I turn it up just a little bit, it's going to flow into the flow map just a little bit, versus if I have it at 100%, it's going to flow into it quite a bit. Now you're not limited to just the flow map. You could also set this to current paper, and I can choose a paper instead. If there's a particular paper that I like, for instance, Featherland, I can paint with that, and you can see that it's going to flow into that paper. And it gives me a really interesting textured result there. You can also try horizontal chaos. Now I don't know that this looks a lot like how traditional watercolor would look. I feel like the flow maps tend to work better, so most of the time I'm going to be using flow maps. But you do get the best of both worlds if you have flow maps selected, because you also get to use the paper grain for the paper you selected. So right now I have flow maps selected, but since I have a paper selected, I'm also getting that paper texture. I'm going to go ahead and set this back to a watercolor paper, and let's move on down to pigment. Now we have settling rate, which adjusts the amount of pigment deposited on the paper after the water evaporates. So right now it's set to 100%. Let's do a stroke. And then let's set it to 0, and let's do a stroke, and let's see how they compare. You can see that it's taking a lot longer to flow, and it's getting kind of a different result, whereas in the center here, it's a bit more broken up, and here it's a lighter, fainter effect. In fact, it's almost disappearing like invisible ink. If I set that to kind of a middle setting here, and I paint, I'm going to get kind of a combination of the two. So you could think of that like the paint is settling much more quickly, and it ends up being much more thicker and more concentrated, versus if I have it too thin, the paint kind of flows around and flows around and flows around and spreads out so much that the pigment isn't very thick and very noticeable. Next we'll take a look at weight, which controls how quickly the pigment settles on the paper. A lighter pigment flows with the water longer, a heavier pigment settles quickly. So let's try a stroke with the weight turned down. And you can see it kind of just basically almost disappears. Again, the water's flowing a lot. Set the weight up higher. Now we get a very, very thick, concentrated amount of paint that isn't flowing quite as much. Now if we adjust the settling rate with the weight, we get some different results. I'll turn the settling rate down with the weight up. I'll turn the settling rate up with the weight down, and we'll see the result we get. So you can see you get lots of different results here depending on what you set these sliders to. Pickup specifies the degree to which water is able to lift dry pigment from the paper. We saw that earlier with the light fringe jitter. When we painted a stroke, and then we painted another one on top of that, it kind of erodes and starts to eat away at the center there. You can see it kind of gets lighter as you paint your strokes. If I turn my pickup up all the way to 100% and I paint, now it's really starting to eat away at that and pick it up. Versus if I turn it all the way down and paint a stroke, let it dry, and then paint again, I'm not getting nearly as much pickup. In fact, it's actually just covering it up and making it darker and darker and darker. I'll show you that again. I'll turn pickup all the way up, and you can imagine this is like your brush picking up some of the paint as you're putting water down. We'll move on down to paper. That's going to control the paper texture and roughness. Let's start with roughness. That lets you adjust the paper roughness, which affects flow resistance, dry rate, and pigment granulation. So that means the paper is going to be more rough or less rough. Let's start by choosing a different paper here. Let's try the small dots. Let's turn the scale of the dots up so we can see exactly what we're going to get here. Let's turn the paper roughness down to 0 and paint a stroke. Then we'll turn it up to 100% and we'll paint a stroke. And it's a pretty subtle difference, but it looks like in the bottom example that the paper grain is eroding the paint more than on top. Now these two strokes look very similar, but basically what's happening here is the dents or the grain is a bit deeper when roughness is set lower. When roughness is set higher, the paper is more shallow. This might be more apparent if we use a flow map, so let's try noisy flow map fringe. Let's reset our brush settings. Let's turn roughness all the way down and let's paint a stroke. We'll set roughness to 100% and we'll paint a stroke. And you can see a pretty clear difference in how it's dealing with the paper. You see much more of the paper texture here when roughness is set to 100%. When it's set lower, it's a bit more shallow and less pronounced. Below that is dry rate, which lets you adjust the rate at which the paper grain can absorb the water. You can see in the example there's more absorption if we set it lower, less absorption if we set it higher. So I'm going to set my dry rate lower, I'm going to paint a stroke. And it's really soaking into the paper there. I'm going to set my dry rate to 100% and paint a stroke. And you can see in the top example, it's much more saturated with paint. Next is granulation, that controls the degree which pigment settles into the valleys of paper grain when it dries. Let's turn granulation down. We'll paint a stroke. You hardly see any paper at all, versus if I turn granulation up, we very clearly see that texture. So again, I can get a lot of different results here if I play with each of these sliders and I go for some different settings. It's really all about experimenting and seeing what works. But what you will notice is I did a lot of different strokes here with a lot of different settings, but they all look pretty much the same. There's not really a whole lot of difference in these. And so while these sliders can be very intimidating, and while some sliders are more effective than others, you really don't need to stress too much about all of these settings. Just experiment, and when you find a look that you like, save that brush and just use that brush. Don't feel like every time you want to do a watercolor painting, you have to constantly move these sliders around while you're painting. These sliders are more for creating brushes rather than painting. Now let's take a look at wind. Wind simulates the effect of the paint moving across the paper in a particular direction, so you could think of that as if you're either tilting the paper and gravity's pulling the paint around, or you're blowing on it with something like a hair dryer, a straw, or even just your breath. So you can control the angle or the direction that the water is going to flow, and you can control the force, which is the amount of force. You could blow on it hard or you can blow on it lightly. So I'm going to go ahead and choose the noisy flow map fringe brush. I'm going to reset it to its default settings. I'm going to choose the horizontal flow map. For the wind to work, you need a flow map selected, so you need flow map enabled here, and you need to turn your flow resistance up from 0 to something. And then I'm going to change the orientation or the angle of the horizontal flow, and I'm going to make that vertical. So we can change that to 90. You can play with the scale too if you want bigger or smaller shapes there for your flow to go into. And then on the force, I'm going to leave that at 0 for now, so we're not going to get any flow right now when I paint. I'll paint a stroke, and it's going to flow out in all directions. It's not picking a particular angle. But if I turn force up and I paint, now it's going straight down because the angle is set to 270, and you can see I'm getting a lot of drip now. If I want it to flow the opposite direction, I'll change my angle to 180, and then I'll rotate my flow map to 180 as well. I can also type that in if that's easier. I'll do a little painting here. You can see that now it's floating sideways. So you could think of this as if I turned the page 90 degrees and now the paint's flowing in that direction. I can also change the angle if I want it to start flowing down. So I can change the angle on the fly if I want to. And really you can change any of these settings on the fly to get some pretty interesting results. And if while you're painting and experimenting with all these different settings, if you decide that you like the way something looks, you can always just dry it immediately and just freeze it there. You don't have to let it continue flowing all the way to the end of its animation. Because sometimes if this is flowing a lot, it's going to end up just kind of drying up and you will end up with nothing. So let's take a look at how to maximize our flow with these settings here. I'm going to turn horizontal flow back to a downward angle, so I'm going to set that to 90. I'm going to change my angle to 90. I'm going to make sure that my paper is just something simple like a watercolor paper. Make sure my force is up. Now it's up to you what kind of paper effects you want. If you want a rougher paper or a softer paper, you can play with that. I'm going to turn roughness up, dry rate up, granulation down. Then in pigment, we want the settling rate to be high. We want the weight of the paint to be lower. We can go ahead and turn off pickup. Flow resistance we want to be at 100% so that we don't get any resistance and it flows a lot. Definitely needs to have flow map checked. Viscosity and evaporation rate we can turn down, and we'll turn wetness and concentration up. Now let's paint a stroke, and it's going to flow up. If we want it to flow down, we can always change the angle to 270, and now our paint will flow down. Let's try that again, and let's see how far down our paint will flow if we just let it go. Now, some people say if you hit spacebar on your keyboard repeatedly, like so, that it's supposed to make your paint dry faster. However, I don't really ever see that happening. I mean, sometimes it seems like it does, and sometimes it seems like it doesn't, but I don't know. You'll have to try it at home and see if it works. So you can see it's really, really flowing there. I get a nice drippy result. Now, unfortunately, Corel Painter isn't quite at the point where you can get really long, really nice, realistic drips like you can in Rebelle or Expressi. But if you want, you could of course draw them in manually like so to have little drips that come down. Or you could optionally right-click on your watercolor layer, convert it to a default layer. Then you could select something like one of your blenders, for example, the coarse oily blender. Now this might be using dab stencil. If it is, you want to turn dab stencil off, and then simply just pull down. You could hold shift to draw a straight line, and you could pull down little drips like this as well. And then if you want it to have that watercolor feel again, what you can do is you can go ahead and drop all of your layers. And then you can go to Layers, Lift Canvas to Watercolor Layer. That takes your canvas and puts it onto a watercolor layer, which basically just makes it wet again, so that you can go in and you can add to it. I'm going to select Noisy Flow Map Fringe again. You can see that I can add paint into this, and it's interacting and it's still wet. Now that's very different than how it was when I dropped all of these layers here. When this is just a regular layer and you can blend it and do things like this, it isn't wet any longer. So if I take a watercolor brush and I try to paint with a watercolor brush on top of an inactive watercolor layer like the canvas here, all it's really doing is just adding watercolor on top of that. It's not interacting in quite the same way as it does when the layer is wet. You can see if I select Light Fringe Jitter, I'm getting that pull where it's lightening it over here. Whereas if I do it on that other layer that's not directly associated with it, it's not going to have that same effect. It's just a layer on top of a layer. So if you want the two layers to interact together, you need to be working with watercolor brushes on that particular watercolor layer. If you wanted to fuse these layers together, again, you could just simply do Drop All, and then go to Layers, Lift Entire Canvas to Watercolor Layer, and now you've fused those two watercolor layers together. And if you wanted to go through here, and again, paint on all those layers to have them all interact with each other, they're all together and they're all wet again. Now while we're talking about flowing paint, let's also talk about a special flow map here, which is called Free Flow, and it's really just a blank flow map. There's nothing going on. And so if I select Noisy Flow Map Fringe with all those wetness settings that I set earlier, and I paint a stroke, you can see that it's just going to flow quite a bit because there's nothing to really resist it. So for example, I could put in little spots like this if I wanted there to be little drips, just going right along the edge of my paint here with a small brush. That's giving all those little drips an opportunity to drip down. A few little spots here too, and have those start dripping. But since there's no flow map to get in the way, it's just going to keep rendering. And then at any point, if you want to stop the animation, you can just click on Dry Watercolor Layer. So that's a look at all the settings in the Real Watercolor panel. You should now have a pretty good idea of what a lot of these settings do, but we can get some additional effects by combining the watercolor functionality with some of the other technology in Corel Painter. For example, we can add a dab stencil to a watercolor brush, and then we can choose either paper, flow map, or texture. Let's try texture. I'm going to choose this first texture, which is Desk Paint, and I'm going to paint a stroke, and you can see that I'm getting kind of a nice texture. It's not showing up quite as well because what I want to do is I want to go ahead and change my paper to a watercolor paper that doesn't have those dots in it. Now that texture is much more apparent. So here's with the texture. And if I turn off the dab stencil and I paint, you can see I'm not getting that same lumpiness. And I think that lumpiness really helps this look more organic. Now I can also use a flow map for a dab stencil, so I can have clouds for the flow map as the dab stencil. All these little holes and breaks are being controlled by the dab stencil flow map. It's stenciling off these areas. We can also combine Real Watercolor with dynamic speckle technology. For example, I have this speckle watercolor drip. This is going to spit out little speckles of paint, as you can see here. And then they flow and bleed like water. Again, I can combine that with the dab stencil, and I could choose either a paper or a flow map. Let's try a paper this time. Let's go with one of these chaos ones here. Let's paint and see what happens. See, we're getting that breaking with the dab stencil, but we're also getting the little speckles of paint. I'm also getting some color variability because I selected it for this brush. If we look in color expression, it's set to color jitter, which means that I can choose a main and additional color, so I could set my additional color to something like red. Then when I paint, I'm getting a combination of both the blue and the red, which is making kind of a purple. But I get some really interesting splattery results, which looks a lot more organic than it would if you don't use the dab stencil and the speckles and so on. So it's really worth experimenting with all these settings. If you want to add dynamic speckles to a brush, or you want to add watercolor to a brush, or you want to add different things, what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to look up here in your general panel. And right now my dab type is set to speckle flow, but I could also choose any of these dynamic speckle settings. I could choose some of these watercolor settings here. For instance, I could choose watercolor spring. Then I'm getting this funky result here. Looks a little strange, but then once you stop painting, the water starts to flow. There's also the subcategory where I can get some different effects. You want to stick to real. There's this real wet buildup, real wet cover. Anything that says real is going to be good. If you use grainy, or wet, that's going to be using the old watercolor technology, and it's not going to look quite as realistic. So I'm going to select my light fringe jitter brush. I'm going to turn off my dab stencil. I'm going to choose a paper that looks more like a watercolor paper. And then let's play with the subcategory to get some different looks. I'm going to try real wet buildup. Let's try real wet cover. Let's try real wet replace. Let's try real dry buildup, real dry cover, and you can see you get different strokes depending on what you choose. And you can feel free to experiment with all these other settings here. You do want to leave the method set to wet though. Otherwise it's going to change it from a watercolor brush to something else. And last but not least, let's talk about enhancing the look of real watercolor to make it look more like traditional watercolor. So first let's discuss erasing. I'm going to go ahead and put down some paint here. And I can always select the eraser, and I can go in here with an eraser and I can erase, but the problem is it's not going to look very realistic because the eraser isn't interacting with the water in a liquidy way. So I have a couple options here. One is I can select a watercolor eraser. For example, I have the wet eraser here, and I can just paint, and that's going to erase. Or I can use just about any watercolor brush with white, and I can paint with white, and that gives me an erasing effect that's kind of wet. I can even paint along the edges and kind of soften them and knock them back a little bit. Now that's not actually adding white paint, it's not adding gouache or anything opaque. You can see if I hide my transparency, there's no opaque white there. So it really is just kind of like adding water to the edges. And we'll see how the white affects these two spots of paint. Now unfortunately it doesn't really blend in this sense, so I can't mix the two colors together. It just ends up kind of erasing. So it does work well around the edges of something, but when you want to try to mix two colors together, it doesn't work. However, if you wanted that effect, what you could do is right-click on that watercolor layer, convert it to a default layer, and then you could use something like Blow, which is a blender. We want to change the flow map to something that has texture like clouds. Then I can kind of blend them together that way if I want them to kind of drip together and be wet. Or I can really use any of my blenders here, like Coarse Oily Blender, to help kind of smudge them together. I could use Just Add Water if I want kind of a more watery look to help blend them together. Now that does kind of start to take away from some of the texture and things like that. So that might not be the kind of look that you want, but there are some things we can do to kind of compensate for that. One is we can add a surface texture overlay, and that's going to do a few things. One is it's going to help this look more realistic, like it's paint on real paper, by giving it texture. And two, it's going to help to kind of cover some of these softer areas and help them blend in. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new layer. I'm going to call it Overlay. I'm going to choose a neutral gray that is 128, 128, and 128 here in your color picker. Or if your color picker is showing as HSV, which mine usually is, it's just 128 for the value and 0 for hue and saturation. Let's go ahead and fill. We can go to Edit Fill, or have a shortcut here. We'll just fill the layer with that color. And then we can choose a watercolor paper. I'm going to go with cold pressed watercolor. You can feel free to experiment with the scale if you want bigger or smaller texture. I'm going to go to Effects, Surface Control, Apply Surface Texture. And you can feel free to do it kind of strong for now so that you can see it, and we can change the opacity to back it down and make it less strong. This is essentially the texture of our paper that we're going to use. You can play with the lighting too as well if you want to move this around or add additional lights, but I'm fine with this angle here. I'm going to click on OK. Then we want to change the composite method to Overlay. And magically that gray disappears and all you see are the light and dark valleys in that texture. And if we zoom in here, you can see that very clearly. Now that's way too strong. So what we're going to need to do is reduce the opacity of that. And then we get a more subtle effect. And in those areas where we blended, it still has a little bit of a watercolor feel now because of that texture being added. And the good thing is, this texture is on its own layer, so we can show and hide it. And we can go behind it and we can add paint. If I want to go in here and paint in some more watercolor, I can do that. Maybe I'll add something darker so that you can really see that texture. And I'll go ahead and turn that texture up so it's very obvious. You can see I'm getting that texture showing over everything as I'm painting. So you may just want to start out this way and have an overlay layer on top of everything while you're working. It may make it feel more intuitive and more like traditional painting. But again, that's too strong, so I'm going to back it down a little bit. You can also help break up the repetitive patterns by adding a mask to that overlay layer. And you can select black, you can select something like the sponge, and you can go ahead and just paint over all of that with the sponge a few times. And what that does is that kind of knocks it back and it reduces it or eliminates it in a few areas so you don't have such a regular pattern. If I turn that back up, you can see it isn't so repetitive because there's some gaps and some little chunks missing. So that does help it to look much more realistic. Another thing you may want to do is go to your canvas layer before you do any painting and just select kind of an off-white color. So you could do kind of a yellow or an orange or a gray, whatever you like, and just fill the canvas with that to tone the canvas. And combined with that texture overlay, it's going to make this look a lot like paper. I'm going to make it a little less yellow and more white. I think something like that works. And then I can go ahead and select my watercolor brushes and I can start painting. And I have my toned canvas, so that helps show the paper texture more. And some people like to start with a canvas that's not pure white. And we have our color overlay on top. And if you wanted to, you could even just save this. You could go to Save As, and you could save this as a template. I could call this WC template. I'll save it as a riff. It's very important to note that if you're working with Real Watercolor and you still want it to be editable, and you want all of your watercolor layers to still be watercolor layers, you need to always save as a Painter riff format. If you save to any other format, those watercolor layers are going to convert to default layers and be no longer wet. So I'll save it as a riff, and then I can simply just delete that watercolor, save it again, and then anytime when I want to work on a watercolor painting, I'll just open this template, go ahead and paint on it. We want to make sure that our paint is underneath the overlay, and then I can save this as a copy if this is my painting that I'm working on, and that way I have my template and then I have my paintings, and I don't have to go through all those steps of adding the overlay and toning the canvas and all that. It's already pre-toned and pre-textured. So there you go, that's a general overview of how to use the watercolor functionality in Corel Painter. Now let's move on to doing an actual example of a painting. Let's go ahead and paint in orange using some of these preset brushes here and a few of the techniques that I showed you.